Good afternoon. My name is Christian Tonkin. I'm the Procurement and Business Management section chief. Along with me today, I also have our two contracts analysts for non-IT contracts, Mark Valim and Jose Regalado. We also have with us Ramon Machado. Ramon is a retired annuitant, and he joined BMB to assist us in a variety of special projects, including developing and presenting these trainings, the non-IT contract management training that we're having today, as well as a few others you're going to see roll out in the next few months. Ramon's also going to be presenting. Please mute your cell phones and microphones, and please hold all questions until the end of the presentation, or you can add them to the chat section. Please also keep your camera turned off so we can maintain connectivity. We're going to have two different sections of the presentation where you'll be able to ask your questions verbally if you don't add them to the chat. We have two different parts to the presentation, this particular portion, and then there's going to be a section that goes over the new BMB 003 contract expenditure form. Today we will be discussing the following topics and providing you the most effective approach to contract management. What and why, separation of duties, contract manager do's and don'ts, ethics, record keeping, and contract performance. What is the contract manager's role as a fiduciary agent for the department? In your case, it means that CDI has entrusted you to ensure that any and all contractors conduct themselves courteously and professionally at all times. You'll also ensure that the contractor meets all expectations and requirements of the contract, and you'll oversee the contract budget and appropriate disbursement of funds on behalf of the state. Additional information about contract management can be found in State Contracting Manual, Volume 1, Chapter 9.0, which is titled Contract Management. We're going to talk about separation of duties right now. Per State Administrative Section 7280, that SAM section says, no one person should control more than one of any of the key aspects of a procurement activity or process. For example, the requester cannot be the approver. So on a contract request form BMB 005 or a service authorization request form admin 001, the contact person or contract manager cannot be the same person that's approving the request. So in effect, that's so that you can't approve your own request. It has to be two separate people. Now I'm going to hand over the presentation to one of our contract analysts, Mark Valim.
Hello, everybody. So a contract, oops, hold on. There you go. A contract manager will review the contract specifications to ensure that the work will be completed and meet the branch's needs, ensure compliance, and that the funding authority is available to contract out, ensure compliance, maintain contract documentation and monitor your contract to ensure compliance, maintain all correspondence and documentation related to the contract in your own file, access and request. Submit your amendment as soon as possible when additional time or monies are required. Within 6 to 9 months of the end of the contract term, contact the BMB to initiate a renewal of the contract if applicable. We cannot emphasize enough to not wait until the last minute. Note, we cannot amend an expired contract. Review invoices. Ensure the line items are listed correctly on the invoice. Don't pay the vendor for services that have not been performed or completed. Use the scope of work SOW for reconciliation of services performed. Timely and dispute or approve invoices. Make sure to dispute invoices that are inaccurate. Do not pay for something that has not been completed to the specifications in your SOW. Monitor contract expenditures. This will keep you up to date, alert you if an amendment is needed, add additional funds, and ensure that the vendor is invoicing timely and accurately. BMB monitor the use of DVBE to confirm that the contractor is utilizing DVB subcontractors that they have listed. Contact B&B if you have any issues that cannot be resolved at the branch level. Be sure to address any issues sooner rather than later. Approve final deliverables and/or services. This takes place before you approve the final invoice. Verify that the contractor has fulfilled all requirements. Do not approve the final invoice if the services have not been completed. Closing out the contract. Verify that the work is completed. Contact the contractor to submit a final invoice. Approve the final invoice for payment. Notify the accounting office and the B&B contracts unit that the contract is closed. Complete the standard 4 contract evaluation form, and this is for consulting contracts only. This should be completed, file a copy, and sent to B&B. Negative evaluations are distributed by B&B to TGS and the contractor. Now let's review contractor managers' don'ts. If you instruct the contractor to start work before the contract is executed, then you are legally liable to pay those fees. If you have the contractor perform work that is not specified in the contract, again, you are legally liable to pay for work performed. Contracts improperly managed can result in incomplete and/or failed projects and cost overruns. For more information, see State Contracting Manual, Volume 1, 9.05. At this time, I'm going to hand the remaining slides over to our other contract analyst, Jose Regalado.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you had a good lunch. So my name's Jose Regalado. I'm the other contract analyst here in B&B Contracts Unit. So basically, to start, we're going to go into ethics. We're talking about the State Contract Manual, Volume 1, 9.07A, which reads, a state officer or employee shall not engage in any activity or enterprise which is clearly inconsistent, incompatible, in conflict with, or inimical to his or her duties as a state officer or employee. SCM Volume 1, 9.07B reads, even the appearance of questionable or unethical practices is detrimental to both employees and their departments. Next slide, please. Now, when we go into ethics, we talk about acting professionally. We want to make sure we do not mix friendships with business. We do not want to engage in incompatible activities. We want to be aware that perceptions will override reality. What does that mean? You may be doing something that is perfectly legal or within reason, but if it appears to be that you're doing something unethical, we have to be careful for that also. You want to involve B&B contracts unit when there's any question in this type of activity, and you want to avoid conflicts of interest or unethical behavior. If a contract manager is experiencing ethics concerns with a contractor, they must contact the B&B contracts unit for recommendations and action moving forward. The B&B contracts unit will involve CDI legal if we feel it's necessary. Incompatible activities. Each department creates rules prescribing activities and enterprises which may be set forth in policy and an incompatible activity statement. Each department also adopts its own conflict of interest code in which it designates officers and employees that are subject to the department's conflict of interest rules. Departments may impose additional requirements that are stricter than those required by law. For your reading pleasure, you can look at SCM Volume 1, Section 9.07E, and also the CDI Incompatible Activity Statement. For more information, please see Volume 1 and the CDI Incompatible Activity Statement, as I said above there. The purpose of the Incompatible Activities Statement is to identify those activities that the Department of Insurance has determined to be inconsistent, incompatible, or in conflict with the duties of CDI officers or employees. This is Government Code Section 19990. This incompatible activity statement is applicable to all officers and employees of the Department of Insurance. Now we're going to get into a little bit of what we see in the contract file, some of the folders you might find there. You would see a BMB 003, that's a contract expenditure monitoring worksheet. BMB 005, which is your contract request. So at this point, you should have an approved contract request in your file. Any communications we've had, your fiscal purchase order, invoices, the standard 213 agreement, and executed with exhibits, I'm sorry, and also the standard 215 agreement summary. It is important to remember that all documents generated are a matter of public record. Based on the Public Records Act, a copy of any contract may be requested at any time. Some additional folder types that you may find are things such as reports and or deliverables based on the contract's scope of work. Some samples of the documents you may find in the communications file can be related to issues with performance of the scope of work, the contractor not meeting scheduled project segments and or tasks as prescribed in the contract, the changing of staff performing the duties in contract, for instance, with a consultant, like if the consultant leaves the firm, they may have to have someone replace that position. And so you'd want to make sure to take note of that. You also want to make sure all contracts are able to stand on their own accord. So what does that mean? That means that within your file, you should have every piece of documentation from when this was first requested all the way to the last invoice. Contractor's performance. Contractor's performance issues or unsatisfactory work must be fully documented in writing on a letter via certified mail. And it also must be a part of the contract file or e-file. The contract manager should notify B&B contracts analyst. They should notify the contractor in writing. They should explain to the contractor why the work is not satisfactory. They should provide the contractor with the corrective action expected and the time period by which they should satisfactorily perform that work. They should dispute invoices if necessary and complete dispute form STD 209. And they should notify the contractor via certified mail to stop work if corrective action is not met. So in summary, we've gone through and defined roles and responsibilities. We've spoken about separation of duties, contract manager do's and don'ts, ethics, record keeping, and contractor performance. Now that we have defined the roles and responsibilities of the contract manager, let's move on to questions.
Hi, everyone. Does anybody have any questions at this point? I'm looking at the chat and there's no questions in the chat, but does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask at this point? Okay. Next slide, please. This slide here has useful links for your contract manager to reference. The first link is the link to, we call it the SCM. It's a state contracting manual. Volume 1 is for services, and Chapter 9 is the one that applies to contract management. The next link is the contract management page on the B&B internet website. We also have the non-IT procurement page under the B&B homepage, as well as the B&B Academy page. This training will be recorded and will be placed on the B&B Academy page in the near future, as well as this PowerPoint presentation, so you'll have access to the slides. Another helpful link is the prohibited practices in the state administrative manual, or otherwise referred to as SAM most commonly. That section is 3504. Now I'm going to hand the presentation over to Ramon Machado, and he is going to go over the revised B&B 003 contract expenditure and monitoring worksheet.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to talk about the newly revised B&B 003, titled the Contract Encumbrance and Expenditure Monitoring Worksheet. This form is available on the B&B intranet site under Forms. It was previously titled Contract Expenditure Monitoring Sheet. Okay, so let's go down to some various areas of the worksheet. In the upper part, you have the branch over the contract, the contract manager contact information. Then you have the contract ID, the total dollar amount that's for the contract in its entirety, the contractor name, terms and dates. If this contractor has is subcontracting with DVBE or small business contractors, you'll have their information in this upper part as well with the certification numbers. And then we go down to the lower left, we have the encumbrance section. As you can see here, you can break this up by fiscal years, or if you have different funding sources, which we'll go over that example in the near future, you would be able to break it up into 7 line items of this form. You have the index and PCA, you have a fiscal PO number as it applies, the amount encumbered. Then when you go under the invoice information, you're going to have the area for invoice amount. If your contract does percentage or dollar withholds for every invoice, you would list those here. Then you have the amount paid, the invoice ID or number, invoice date, service period beginning to end. If there are deliverables identified on the invoice consistent with the contract language, you would put that here. Fiscal receiving number, which we'll cover shortly. And then to the far right in the pink header is a section so that you can, on the same worksheet, dispute an invoice, put the reason why you're disputing it, and if it is resolved timely or not, you would have a resolution date to put there. And even though it doesn't show up on the slide, later on I'll be doing a live demo and I'll show you that there is a second tab to this document. It's in Excel format, and the second tab are the instructions. So everything we talk about today, you'll be able to see on the instruction tab, and it'll tell you what each field should consist of and where the data will originate from. Okay, so let's start with the first example. We're going to look at a standard contract, and the information we take throughout these examples is going to be consistent in what we take from the standard 215, the agreement summary, and the standard 213, the standard agreement. So up here with indicated by the letter A would be your contract number, agreement number. B is the contractor's name. C would be the division, bureau, or the unit that is over this contract. D, in section 11, projected expenditures, you're going to see your fiscal year. E is going to be under the optional use, you're going to have your index and PCA. And then F being the amount encumbered for this contract. And then G is going to be the term of this contract, 10/1 through 12/1 of 2020. From the standard 213, you're going to want to pull the under project representative is going to be your contract manager. And also, we just wanted to point out on the standard 213, you're going to want to be able to refer to the scope of work and the budget detail and payment provisions as you audit and approve invoices that come in for this contractor. So now we're going to look at a B&B 003 that has this information transferred to it. Okay, so you see here, C is the branch. Then we have H, the contract manager contact information pulled from the standard 213. The rest of this data, the contract ID, contractor B, the original term dates, G, then we have fiscal year, D, E is the index and PCA for the contract, and then the amount encumbered, the 6,000. Again, you're going to want to tie this number back to the face sheet on the standard 215. Okay. So now we're going to look at an invoice. So this is the first invoice submitted for this contract. And these are the common or consistent data elements we're going to take from the invoices and put on the B&B 003. First, we have the invoice number indicated with the letter I, and then the fiscal receiving number, the letter J, and then we have K being the invoice date, and over here I being the service period for this invoice, and then M indicating the total amount of the invoice being billed. Now, as you look at this invoice, you're going to want to make note to the billing at $100 an hour. As you audit this, you're going to want to go back to the Standard 213, the payment provisions, and confirm that this is the rate that was indicated in the Standard 213. So now we're going to take this information and we're going to put it onto the B&B 003. So here we have the invoice amount indicated by the letter M. And since there is no withhold per the contract language in this, there's 0 amounts to add. Therefore, the amount invoiced is going to be the amount paid here. The letter I being the invoice number or ID. Then we have the invoice date with K. The service period being L, 10-1 to 11-1. And then the fiscal receiving number J here. We'll cover that in just a moment. And something to point out, as you enter invoice and paid amounts, it will automatically reduce your remaining encumbrance. So as you have entries into there, it'll continually go down, and so that you can have a up-to-date assessment of whether you may or may not need to add funds to your contract. And the same goes for as you post invoices, they will total here, showing your total amount paid to date. Okay, so now that's a standard contract. We're now going to go over a multi-year contract. Oh, first, I'm sorry. We're going to talk about the FMD invoice tracking system. So in there, we had a fiscal receiving number that once a package is submitted for a receipt, it will then receive a fiscal receiving number out of the invoice tracking system. You can find access to this invoice tracking system on the B&B webpage, and as you get a copy of this slide deck, this is a link that'll take you straight to the FBMD invoice tracking system. Now we're going to talk about multi-year contracts. So as we look at the Standard 215 for this, we're looking at some of the same information. We have the agreement number A, B, your contractor's name, C, the division. Now, the difference here you're going to notice with D, since we have a multi-year contract, we're going to have 2 fiscal year entries here, which will carry over to the B&B 003. And because of that, we have 2 separate expenditure amounts for each fiscal year. Then we still have the index and PCA, even though it's a multi-year contract, we're still paying out of the same funding source. Then the total amount of the contract being G here, and then H giving you the term of the contract, January 1 through 6/30 of the following year. And from the Standard 213, you're going to pull the same information. Your project representative is going to be your contract manager with their contact information, and you still use the scope of work, payment provisions, so on and so forth. So let's look at the B&B 003 now with that information transfer. Okay, so up here C, we still see that we have the branch, contract, manager information, the contract ID per the 215. Note the original dollar amount is the total amount. Even though it's a multi-year contract, we're going to record the total amount of the contract here. The contractor, and then the B, and then the term dates, H, January to June of the following year. So now let's look at the encumbrance information. Now we have 2 fiscal years, so we're going to have 2 different line items for this particular B&B 003. Under 1920, we have the index and PCA, which are the same for each fiscal year, but now we have the encumbrance amounts indicated with the letter F. So for fiscal year 1920, we had 15,000. For 2021, we had 12, totaling 27,000. So you're going to take the total amount encumbered just as a point of reference and confirm that it's what you have put here, where letter G reflects the original total dollars amount. Okay, so now let's look at an invoice submitted by the same contractor. Again, we're consistent in the information that we acquire from these documents. So we're going to look at J being the invoice number, K, the invoice date. M, we have the fiscal receiving number we had talked about earlier. We have L, the date of service, and then N, which is the total amount of the invoice. So now we're going to take this information and we're going to put it onto the BMB 003. Okay, so now what I've done is I put examples of 2 invoices just to show how the amounts are calculated. So in this case, under the invoice amount, we have 2 different invoices, different amounts. There's no withhold, so therefore the amount paid is the same that is invoiced. We have 2 different invoice IDs or numbers in this case, so we indicate that here. The 2 different invoice dates. The service periods happen to be the same, but we know they're not duplicate because they're different invoice numbers. And they each have their own fiscal receiving number here with the letter M. And to note, we spoke earlier that as invoices are logged into this sheet, you'll see that the remaining encumbrance for that particular line item will automatically reduce. And as a total will reduce for the remaining encumbrance. And as you put the invoice amounts paid, it'll show you what has been paid to date as well. Okay, so now we're going to go to a split funded contract. Under this contract, we have 1 fiscal year, but we're doing multiple funding sources. So again, from the 215, we got the agreement number. We have B, the contract name. C, the division bureau of the unit. D, we have 1 fiscal year indicated here. We have a total encumbrance amount here with the letter E. And then under F, you can see that we have 2 different funding sources indicated by different index and PCAs, and they have their associated dollar amounts. So these are the amounts that we're going to transfer over to the BMB 003 under the encumbrance information. And G is going to give us the term of this contract. And then H gives us, again, the contract manager information, the scope of work. And then here they've given a breakdown of how the expenses are going to be accrued or charged to this contract by index and PCA. So let's see how that information looks on the BMB 003. Okay, so now we have branch, contract ID, contract manager information, contractor, term dates. And then now as we go down to the encumbrance information, we show the same fiscal year, in this case, 21-22, but now we have the 2 separate funding sources creating their own line items. So under 90450, they have the 10,339.60 as consistent with the 215. Same as the 90035 PCA. The amount encumbered, again, should be consistent with what's in the standard 215. As you combine them for the total encumbrance of 13,616 up here for the original total dollars, that should again tie into your standard 215 face sheet. Okay, so now let's take a look at an invoice for the split funded contract. So again, we have the date of the invoice, we have a fiscal receiving number, we have invoice number, we have the service period covered, and under M we have here the 2 amounts that are being billed. So what they've done on this invoice is they've taken the total invoice amount of $960 and broken it out by the percentage of PCAs, and then calculated out what's going to be paid to each PCA. And they've even broken out the PCAs here in the bottom part of the invoice, as indicated with the letter N. So now let's look at that information on the BMB 003. Okay, so under invoice amount, we have here 2 separate invoices that were received. We show the dollar amount for each PCA. That is, so for this particular PCA, we have 2,675. For the other PCA, they were billing $856, and the same would go for the second invoice. We have separate invoice numbers indicated by the letter J. We have invoice dates. These invoices were all submitted at the same time, so at the same date. That's not a big deal. Then we have the service periods as indicated by K. Now, as we noted, the remaining encumbrance is automatically calculated every time you enter numbers into this area. It also keeps track by PCA, what you've been billed to totally by PCA, also what each individual remaining encumbrance amount would be for each of those PCAs in addition to totally for the contract. And this bottom area here will total everything that you've been invoiced to date and that you've paid to date. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at service authorizations. Service authorizations are usually used when it's under $10,000. So they can be for $9,999.99. They'll come in the form of a purchase order. The information we're going to take from the purchase order, it's the chart field version, the Fiscal purchase order chart field version. We're going to take A, the purchase order number, B, the supplier, in this case, contractor. It would give you the buyer information and the phone number, so that would be your contract manager information. D here gives you some funding information as far as the PCA goes. C is going to give us the term of the service authorization. So one thing to note, as you can see here in green, you only need to do the B&B 003 if your service authorization is ongoing. So obviously, if you're doing a one-time service authorization, that's going to be one PO, one invoice, one and done. You do not have to do the B&B 003. It is purely for purely for recurring service authorizations. Then down here in E, we have the tracking number that is from the non-IT tracking database. And then we have the payment provisions on how it's going to be billed or what rates or, consistency of how the invoices will come in. So now let's look at this information on the B&B 003. Okay, so here we have under E, that's the non-IT tracking log number here in E. F is going to be the total amount of the service authorization. Under B, under contractor field, is the vendor shredded. Then we have the term dates of this service authorization. And then under the encumbrance, we have the fiscal year, the PCA that was provided on the service authorization, the Fiscal PO number that was also provided for you, and then the amount encumbered. Again, this will tie into what you see on the service authorization itself to make sure that you're, not mistyping or transposing numbers. Okay, so let's look at an invoice now for this service authorization. So we have the invoice number, we have an invoice date, we have the total invoice charges here with the letter J. Under K, we show line items being charged for the service authorization. Again, this information should be tied back to the original SAU so that you can ensure that they're billing you correctly and at the correct rate. And then under L here, we have the total invoice amount, $133.50. So now let's take that and we're going to put that on the B&B 003 under the invoice information section. So again, we have the invoice amount indicated with letter J. There's no withholds. So the amount invoiced is the amount paid. Then we have the invoice ID or number provided on the invoice date, and then the service period. And note that as we record the invoices, again, your remaining encumbrance will always be a running balance as you record invoices throughout the life of this particular service authorization. Okay. That concludes the demonstration. We're going to go on to a live demo in a minute, but I wanted to stop and pause to see if anybody had any questions regarding the B&B 003 and how it's used.
This is Christian. We don't have any questions in the chat.
Okay. One thing to reiterate before I go on to the demo is the B&B 003, we created it to be a useful tool for contract managers so that you can stay on top of your contracts, be aware of amounts, end dates, so that it may in some way alert you to the need you may need to do an amendment to add funds or extend the dates. But it's a good tool and we recommend that you use it moving forward. And it is available, as I stated previously, on the B&B intranet site under their forms. You can download it and save it to your contract files starting today. Okay, so now we're going to go on to a live demo. Give me 1 second, sorry. Okay. Okay, so we're going to start with a standard 215, the agreement summary, and we're going to complete the fields that we just discussed in the demonstration onto the BMB 003. So here I'm going to take the agreement number and I'm going to put that right here into the BMB 003. Okay, and then I can see here what the contractor's name is. So I've put that information here, West Publishing Corporation. Then I'm going to look at the division and populate that field for the branch. Contract manager information, we'll pull that from the, when you go to the standard 213, you're going to look down here and you're going to see a section that is project representative. So from here, is where you're going to get your contract manager contact information. So again, from the 215, we got our term dates. Well, let's do we have our fiscal year here. So we're going to do 2021. The index and PC are down here in this area right here. So we're going to put those, populate the BMB 003. Okay, we don't particularly have a fiscal PO number at this time. If and when we get a fiscal PO number, we can enter it in this field here. The amount encumbered, this is a single funding source, single year contract. So we're going to put the full amount here, 137,640. We're going to move up here to the original dollar amounts. So this agreement total is you're going to take that and you're going to populate the original total dollars. Okay. As we scroll down a little bit more, here we get our term dates under section 12 of the standard 215 under agreement. So our start date is 07/01/2020, and then it ends on June 30. Okay. So now that's all the information that we need that we've taken from the standard 215 and the standard 213. So now we're done with those documents, but you know, you should have a safe copy of this in your contract file, e-file in your network folder. So now we're going to record the first invoice submitted by this contractor. So we have the invoice amount here, $11,699.90. So we're going to put that. And per the stipulations of this contract, there is no withhold or breakout. So we're going to say the amount invoiced is the amount that we're going to pay. Okay. Now we have an invoice ID number here. There. So we're going to put that information in the box under invoice ID or number. Okay, we have an invoice date here, invoice date of May 1st. And then we have a service period. For this particular invoice, it's a lengthy document, but I found that on page 3 tells me what the service period is for this particular contract. So, or this invoice, I should say. So we're going to go 04/01/2021. The end of the service period was April 30. Okay, there are no deliverables per se that are required to report per the contract language. And we do have a fiscal receiving number up here, 2913. So we're going to enter that. And we're not disputing anything. This invoice is good. You're going to audit it against your scope of work and your billing provisions, and you come to the conclusion that it's approved and ready to pay. So you're going to follow that process, but now your worksheet has been updated, so we show that we've been invoiced and we're going to pay 11,000. That leaves us a remaining encumbrance of 125,940 and an amount paid to date of 11,699.90. Excuse me. Now that we're on here, let me show you the instructions. So as I stated earlier, we've included instructions for the B&B 003. We have a brief description, and then for each field that potentially could have data populated in it, we identify or define what that data is and where that data should come from. Just note that this is going to be moving forward somewhat of a living document because it's kind of new to record this information to this detail. So as the contract managers utilize this form, we'll be able to make changes and updates to better serve the contract managers of CDI. All right, that concludes the live demo. Do we have any questions now? Anybody awake? Thank you.
We do not have any questions in the chat. Does anybody want to ask? You can ask questions about any part of the presentation. It doesn't just have to be about the live demo that Ramon just presented. I think one of the things that we should hit on or reemphasize that Ramon already mentioned was that it's not just for formal contracts. You're a contract manager. If you're listed as the contact or project representative or contract manager, they're all basically the same thing. On a service authorization, so service authorizations are also contracts. We use the terms contracts and service authorizations, but they're both agreements, by two parties to perform services, and there's a financial liability there. So the difference is that a service authorization is less formal than a contract, a formal contract where we use a standard 213 standard agreement. Those are typically for $10,000 or more, and service authorizations are always less than $10,000. But if you have a service authorization, you're identified as the contact, and it's for recurring services, you're acting as a contract manager. You are, even if it's a one-time service, but you don't have the need to track all these expenditures. If it's a one-time service, they're going to perform. You're going to do the same thing. You're going to review the invoice and make sure that the contractor performed the work they were supposed to, as they were supposed to, according to however it's specified, in their quote and in the service authorization, the FisCal PO, before you pay them. But if it's for recurring services, it's just the same as it would be for a larger contract. Recurring services, some examples are like shredding services, where they're coming out, could be as needed, could be quarterly, could be, it could be bi-monthly, anything that's recurring over a period of time. You're performing the same functions and you have to track your expenditures. Now, it's really important to emphasize the importance of tracking your expenditures for two reasons. If you're going to run out of money, you would need to add money if it's allowable. A service authorization can't exceed that penny under $10,000. So if you're already at the max, you're not going to be able to amend your service authorization to add funding. But if your agreement is for less than that, you may be able to, depending on how it was bid, more or less. But the one big thing that we want to prevent is overexpending. So if you're not using this document, or you weren't using the previous version of it, was just like a running total, like a regular spreadsheet, you should be doing that, because if you overexpend and we're not able to amend to compensate the contractor, they're going to have to file a claim with the Board of Control, to get the rest of their money if we support that, unless it was the contractor just continued to perform services without us authorizing them. But we've got issues if you're authorizing them to perform services beyond the term or like the maximum dollar amount of the agreement. That's going to create some real problems. So it's also just super important for you to know that if you have any questions, or if, during the course of the performance of a contract, like the contractor's not meeting your expectations or not meeting the scope of work in some way or another, the first thing you need to do, you're going to be in constant communication with the contractor. Some little things you can just work out with them, but if it's actually something that may turn into something bigger, B&B contracts unit needs to know about it immediately so that we can instruct you on how to handle it. Okay. Does anybody have any questions regarding any of that? It doesn't look like it, but you can still feel free to ask questions. I mentioned previously that this training is going to be posted on the B&B Academy page soon. In addition to the recording of it will be on there, as well as the actual slide deck presentation. So you'll be able to go back through these things. And Ramon's got real good instructions on the instruction tab of the B&B 003. So I think those are pretty thorough. If you review the instructions and review the training, you should be able to get through it. Okay, if we don't have any further questions, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. I wanted to thank you all for taking the time to attend this training session today. I hope you found it beneficial. If you have any feedback one way or another, please let us know so that we can incorporate it into like further, iterations of this training. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day.